So that was an incredible introduction, setting out all the issues that we're going to be addressing in the next panels. So I hope we'll have some solutions. I think there will be narratives that will respond to some of the things that were being said. And I'd like to thank this incredible panel. Rhonda's gone. Kaylee, you did an incredible job of moderating a very complex set of answers, and the panelists, thank you so, so much. I know you're all very busy, and we really, really appreciate your presence here, so thank you. I'd like to call on our next panel to come up. Mo is our moderator. And we also have Mary Ellen Iskandarian, the president of Women's World Banking, who regretfully cannot be with us, but is with us online. So we have the hybrid solution.
Thank you, everybody. Everyone, that moderation was so perfect. I need y'all to lower your expectations. Lower the expectation. I'm waiting for Mary Ellen, actually, to see if she will appear online. My name is Mojgan Sami. My students call me Dr. Mo. Is my student Sarah here? Where are you, Sarah? Hi, Sarah. Visiting all the way from Kosovo to come see her old professor. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Is DT here? DT? I don't see her. No worries, no worries. We had a little surprise, but we'll do that later. I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm so excited as a health scientist that I heard all about global health at the earlier panel. So if you will indulge me just briefly, we know that climate change is the primordial cause of so many diseases. Rise of infectious disease like malaria, rise of chronic diseases. We ask the question in global health, why do we treat people for disease and then send them back to the conditions that made them sick in the first place? So everything y'all are gonna do with climate action is directly beneficial to the health of the human population. So I love that this conversation is integrating the fields of climate and health and all of the above that you talked about earlier. That was so delightful. Remember, I told you to lower your expectations. When you are faced with a threat as a human society, what do we say? What is our response when we're faced with a threat? What do we say? Fight or? You know there's more. There are more responses. There's freeze. There's another one that women are very good at. Unite. This has been a theme that has come up over and over today. Radical connection. Unite. So I want you to do something for me in terms of adaptation. I need you to adapt your perspective. I need you all to look at the planet from the perspective of an astronaut. Look at the planet. Climate change, global greenhouse gases, all of the things that we talk about don't understand borders. They don't understand right wing, left wing, they think it's a bird. Only flies together. The planet is suffering. Our ecological crisis cannot be divided up into countries and territories. It has to be a global conversation that includes a global perspective. So I want you to hold that thought of a planetary system that we are discussing. This panel, with my wonderful esteemed panelists here, I have Megan Fallon, the founder of Step Up Advisors. I have Maria Isabel on the stage, Maria Isabel Torres, who is the director and a journalist with Mongabay Latin America, Mongabay Latam. And I have Lawrence Haddad here, who is the executive director of GAIN, and Mary Ellen Iskandarian, president and CEO of Women's World Banking, joining us from New York. I'm not going to detail with all of their fabulousness because I want the questions that I asked to help them tell us about their organizations. This panel is allowing us to set the stage We already set your mindset, right? Planetary. We're going to also set the scene of how climate change is affecting the lives of women from underserved communities and share how each of your respective organizations are addressing to provide or leverage solutions to help communities with everything from food insecurity and food security to livelihoods, access to water, land use and protection, regeneration of the environment, and access to funding, forced migration. So I'm going to start with Mary Ellen, if you don't mind, if you can hear me. Hi, Mary Ellen. I want you to also tell the audience as much about yourself as you would like and your organization, but answering the question, how your organization is addressing solutions to the key issues that are faced by the women and the communities that you serve. Please, Mary Ellen, go ahead.
Hi, Mo. It's so great to see you. And I only regret that I'm not there in Geneva with all of you. Although I will point out that two of my colleagues, Francesca Christ and Shaheen Verji, are there in the audience with you. So I hope you'll say hello to them at one of the breaks. And thank you, Atalanti, for including me. I am always so inspired by your words, but I love this idea of a conference of hope and action. That was really quite beautiful. Women's World Banking, for those of you who don't know us yet, is a global nonprofit organization, NGO, that has for the last 45 years worked as an NGO to work with financial service providers so that they can develop products and financial solutions that really get right to the heart of women's needs, women's pain points. But we also work with governments, both local and at the global level, so that they are designing inclusive policies as well. More recently, about 12 years ago, we became a Gender Lens investor as well. And that's, I think, brought a new urgency and a new power to the work that we do with inclusive finance institutions, making sure that they are both serving more women clients, but also doing so in more gender diverse organizations. Atalanti opened the conference by talking about a lack of access that many of the women that we are talking about today have a lack of health, education, water. Well, unfortunately, you can add financial services to that list. And we recently did some analysis and found that 753 million women in climate vulnerable countries are also completely without access to basic financial services. And I think I just maybe need to underscore why that might be so important, because financial services, when I talk about that, I mean very, very basic, very bread and butter things that perhaps we take for granted. The ability to make and receive payments, which was particularly important in moments of climate disaster, a safe place to save, access to credit if you have a business or you need to make a significant purchase, and then insurance in order to protect all that you've managed to achieve. And really, those services, working with institutions and governments to make sure that more women have access to those services, is really about bringing them financial resilience. And to get to the way you phrased the question, Mo, what Women's World Banking has really come to realize in these last several years is that financial resilience is a critical, fundamental part of climate resilience as well. Maybe I can just give a quick example of one of the, a project that we did with one of the largest state-owned banks in India, Bank of Baroda, that we did not initially think of as a climate-related product. We were trying to help the bank reduce the dormancies that it had on a savings account that it offered specifically for low-income people. And so we were trying to increase the usage of those accounts with savings accounts, and then if the clients were saving in a way that they had committed to do so, they would become eligible for an emergency loan. But then what we saw, and it was very successful, the bank was very happy, we were seeing usage, But what we found last year in Uttar Pradesh, particularly in some of the more rural and remote regions, is that the women who had access not only to this emergency savings, but then that loan that they could call on in the case of disaster were far more resilient. Their families were protected, the kids stayed in school, they were able to continue to eat 3 meals a day. Importantly, they were able to build back and able to plant faster than the other families once the floodwaters had receded. And so what I think we're recognizing is that some of our bread and butter products, some of our existing programs are very applicable to the climate crisis, but perhaps we need to think of some new approaches to be able to work at scale. And just very quickly, I'll say we're finding that the bundling of financial services can be very effective. In the Horn of Africa, Women's World Banking is a part of a project where we're bundling an existing livestock insurance product that has been quite successful, but maybe the women are not renewing the product at quite the rate that the insurer had hoped. And we're bundling that with a health and life product, which the women said they very much needed. It was sort of more accessible for them to understand. And frankly, putting those two things together makes it a more sustainable product for the insurance company. A company that we're an investor in that many of you may be familiar with, Pula, has bundled agricultural lending and insurance, which not only provides badly needed agricultural insurance in cases of drought and flood for smallholder women farmers in Africa, and now in Pakistan, actually, they've moved to South Asia, but it also lowers the collateral requirements of their loans and the interest rate on those loans. And then I'll just close by saying it's not only about financial services, but the previous panel talked about some important, I think Rhonda mentioned, important early warning systems. So we're seeing non-financial interventions like early warning systems, like telehealth for livestock, things that are sort of clever non-financial interventions that can lower the cost of a financial product as well. So I'm going to stop there, but really look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Mary Ellen, so much. I think that that's a big theme, the bundling, the integration of services, of sectors, of disciplines. This is an area that we have to continually think about. And as I go to Laurence, I just want to mention, I love this notion of resilience, not just being bouncing back, but really helping bounce forward. So I always think of resilience as a process that helps us move forward, not just go backward. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Mary Ellen. Laurence, please, how is your organization addressing some of these key issues?
Is this on? Yes, good, good. I was panicking there for a second. Thank you, Mo, and thank you, Atlanti, for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. The energy is fantastic in the room, and in the reception at lunch was fantastic. Everyone was so warm and friendly. I need to come here more often. So I took the title pretty literally. I'm a pretty literal person, much to my wife's chagrin. I'm very literal, and so I took it, the women at the front line, and I thought about what are the three front lines that gain Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. What are the three front lines that I think would be interesting to discuss? So the first one is delegates at COP. You might think that's a very odd topic, but I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Then the second front line is women entrepreneurs that are producing, supplying, processing, marketing nutritious and safe foods. And there's a big alignment between nutritious foods and climate. Think about it. Nutritious foods tend to be most perishable, therefore most subject to food loss and food waste, and that essentially is wasted emissions. Diets that are healthy tend to be diverse, and diverse diets tend to come from more diverse ecosystems and biodiverse systems. And of course, healthy diets tend to be richer in plant foods, which have a lower emissions, a lower GHG footprint. So there's a big alignment between nutrition and climate. But female entrepreneurs we've heard, have lots of constraints that they face. And the third front line is really, call them last mile vendors, but I think that does them a disservice. They're really, I think of them as first line first mile vendors, and these are the mama mbogas, the vegetable mamas in Kenya, and especially in about 4 or 5 counties in Kenya where we work as GAIN. We work with 10,000 of them. So if I've got, can I have a minute on each? Okay, so on the delegates, I've only been going to COPs for 3 or 4 years. I don't know how many more I'm going to go to. But I was really surprised by, the gender balance at COPs seems to be fairly even. But when you go into the delegates' rooms, where the kinds of things that Mary Robinson was talking about, that the text warriors, the people who are fighting over text, it's all men. Well, it's not all men, I'm exaggerating. It's 2/3 men, because I looked up the statistics. 2/3 of the delegates are men. And a quarter of the, and a quarter of the delegates, 2/3 of the delegates are men, and 3/4 of the delegates are leaders. 3/4 of the delegates who lead the delegations are men. So really low representation, and this matters. This matters because I think women and men have different ways of negotiating, different ways of contesting, different concerns, different preferences, different types of knowledge, different ways of creating knowledge, and it's too much of a monoculture at the moment, the way these texts are negotiated. So that's really, I think, worrying. The good news is it can improve. The numbers have been slowly improving over the COPs. So I hope it doesn't take till 2050 to get to 50%. But at the current rate of change, it will. Second front line is women entrepreneurs. I don't know if any of you have seen the auditions for orchestras. They used to be not behind a curtain, a screen, but now they are behind screens. And that's for obvious reasons. When the panelists, the judges, were looking at the candidates to be in the orchestra, and they saw a woman, there was a bias that made that person less likely to be selected. So now they're always behind screens. And the same thing happens with women entrepreneurs applying for loans. There's a very famous study by the World Bank, actually, from a couple of countries. Turkey was one of them. I can't remember the other. But they did a randomized analysis, and they said, let's look at the process, the mechanics of giving loans credit to entrepreneurs. And it turned out that once you control for everything, the sector, the size, the financials, it was the gender of a woman, the gender of the person applying for the loan, whether it's a man or a woman, that really made the difference. And the fascinating thing is, it made no difference whether the loan officer was a man or a woman. The women were always discriminated against. So we've just set up again, I think it's the first ever blended impact fund called the Nutritious Food Finance Facility, N3F. It's small, it's about $100 million, but it's targeting small and medium enterprises that are producing nutritious food. That means fruits, vegetables, legumes, eggs, dairy, fish, those kinds of foods, for domestic consumption, for consumption within Africa. So not for export, for consumption within Africa. It's the first one ever, and we've got some very strict guidelines about the number of women who will receive these loans, about the selection process, about the winnowing process. There's all kinds of biases that can be built into that. And my third front line, look sternly at me when I'm running out of time. My third front line is the vegetable sellers, the mama mbogas. In Kenya, vegetable consumption is quite low, much lower than the WHO recommends. And why am I talking about vegetables? Vegetables are the ultimate no-regret investment when it comes to nutrition. All forms of malnutrition are diminished when more vegetables are consumed, whether it's obesity, diabetes, stunting, wasting, whatever, anemia. But they're also fantastic for climate emissions, right? For reducing climate emissions. But the climate change is really messing up seasonality for vegetables in Kenya. So these vendors, these mama mbogas, and there's literally just a little stall like this by the side of the road, they simply cannot get reliable reliable sources, reliable supplies of vegetables. So the vegetables they do sell are very tired looking, they just don't look appealing or attractive. There are worries from consumers that the vegetables are being grown in sewer water because there's no rainwater, not enough rainwater. So there are all sorts of things that climate is doing to mess up these frontline women's ability to increase the sales and consumption of vegetables, which is good for nutrition and good for mitigation of climate change. So we are working very hard to connect the mama mbogas with the suppliers to guarantee the food to certify the suppliers in terms of they're not using sewer water, to make sure that the time gaps between selling from the suppliers and selling to the vendors is drastically shortened, so that the vegetables look better, they're fresher, they're safer, and that's the way of adapting to climate change at the front line, at the very front line. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. One thing that Lawrence and I talked about before we came here, we Zoomed together, and I talked about how important it is for our brothers to work side by side with us in this field, because women, when women are included, when women's voices are not just heard, but invited into a conversation, questions change, impacts change, because women fundamentally think differently, and that's a good thing. And so when you have gender equity and balance, you're able to provide ideas in a space that's so generative. And it's fantastic. So I really appreciate the brothers here. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that, Lawrence. Let's go to Maria Isabel. Please, tell us a little bit about your Mongabay. I know it's new in LATAM.
Not so new.
Not so new. You're new to the position, though.
Not so new.
Oh, see, I don't know anything anymore. Can I blame jet lag? Please, go ahead.
No, thank you so much, and thank you again, Atlanti, for having me, because I think I bring a different approach to the table, because journalists, we tell stories, so the question will be how stories can drive a change, and how can we make visible stories like you have told this day, and how can we do that, those needs that you are saying that we have to promote can really be a reality. So first about Mongabay, I've been running Mongabay Latam since its beginnings, that is 8 years ago. And Mongabay Latam is part of Mongabay Global, that is an environmental news platform that publishes original content about the most hard and important environmental issues around the world, with one thing that I consider the most valuable thing that Mongabay has, that is, it has given the opportunity to the journalists around the world to tell these stories in their own context with their own language. So we have different offices in different parts of the world. We have, the first one was Mongabay Indonesia, that covered Indonesia in Bahasa with journalists from Indonesia. We have Mongabay India, that covers India in Hindi and in English. We have Mongabay Latin America, that covers Latin America in Espanol, and with a network of journalists that live on those countries. And we recently have launched Mongabay Africa, that have the challenging job to cover Africa in French and in English. So that gives us the opportunity to understand these problems in our context in order to drive change, because we know what are the interests of our audiences. We know also what are the interests of some politicians that are not really interested in things like that. So we try to manage those needs in order to have change. And one thing that is important in Latin America, I think, is the huge lack of information that we have. And that not only is terrible for making the state and the private sector accountability, but also because we, even as journalists, have difficulty to see like the big picture of what's happening on the field. And our reporting in these last 8 years showed us something that is not something that we really see, that is the important role of indigenous women leaders on the ground, especially in the Amazon. So, as you may know, Latin America is the most dangerous region to be an environmental defenders. Last report from Global Witness says that 166 environmental defenders were killed last year. 85% of those killings come from Latin America. And 1/3 of those killings come from indigenous people. So if you are a woman that is from an indigenous people and is an environmental defender, you have this triple risk around you. And if you, under that premise, decide to defend your territory, it's because the territory is meaning your life. So these women that are amazing, they are not just living in their territory. They are resisting the invasion of the territory. So, and that idea of what's happening on the ground is something that we only know because we have gone to those places. We have talked to them. We have new projects. We have known the indigenous women in Ecuador that had formed and organized a guard to protect the territory from a concession, a mining concession. We have known indigenous Asheninka women that lost their husband killed by land grabbers and forest and loggers, and they have pursued justice for 10 years, and they have brought those responsible into jail. And I have known people and women in Colombia trying to make sustainable enterprises with Amazonian fruits. So what's the thing that I have learned from those experiences? First one is they have told us they don't want to be portrayed only as victims, even if we have to put all this information in context, because they are suffering, of course. Some of them are dying, but they are also resisting. They are playing an active role, and we have to find a way to acknowledge that role and put their circumstances in context. And I also think that we have to try to do, and that's something that we try to do in Monga Bay, to have this holistic idea of what's happening. Because when we say they are defending the territory, we are not only referring to the geographical space. When we are saying they are defending the territory, and that's why they are putting their lives on the line, is because they understand the territory as the space for their culture, the space where they can speak their language, the space that provides food, health, and the space that provide a space that provides the livelihood for their community and for their family. That's the one thing. And the other is that there's always a debate about how we can talk about this solution without ignoring what's happening. Why solution? No? Something that some journalists said, no, solution, why? Because the problems are bigger and we have to understand the problems, and recycling is not going to stop climate change, right? But why solution? Because first of all, we have to provide the audience that there are things that are working, so they can ask their authorities, okay, do that. Because if we always say that everything is going to end, the world is going to end, but let's do nothing. So their solution, there is people that is doing these things, and these things are working. Indigenous people has proven with scientific data that they are protecting the forest better than anybody. So we have to acknowledge that. But the other thing is that we have to also put those solutions in context, in terms that maybe solutions that work in Ecuador are not going to work in Colombia, are not going to work in Indonesia, are not going to work in other parts. Indigenous people are very different between different ethnias. What is going to work for Ashaninka people in Peru maybe is not the same for Ashaninka people in Brazil, because it's the same people but in different countries. So we have to acknowledge the diversity in the solution. And that's something that, for example, in Monga Bay we can do, because we try to keep this global point of view, but focusing on the local point of view of the people on the ground. So I think that's the main part that we in Monga Bay are trying to do, making these stories possible and trying to shift this narrative to one of resistance and a little bit of optimism.
I appreciate that so much. And you know, journalism, the power of story that you mentioned, as a qualitative researcher, I teach my students that stories are data with a soul. And that if you learn to understand the patterns that are discussed by the community, you will see a direct connection to what they are asking for, and then you can connect them as researchers to the organizations that will help them get access to what they need, whether it's financial or food security or livelihood. But stories are data with a soul. I want us to remember that when we think of data. Megan, please tell us a little bit about Step Up Advisors and how it connects to our conversation here.
So firstly, I'd just like to say that I think what we have to appreciate about Monga Bay is that it is now being quoted as a legitimate source for fact-based decision-making. And I think that transition and being able to see that this power of not just story, but that this is factual accounting and that it's being seen in that light, I think is really an important thing. And that was not happening, 10 years ago in the climate movement, there were almost no mechanisms for that.
Just to say, as a qualitative researcher, stories are fact. So please, I totally agree with you, yes.
So I've had a sort of interesting background, and it relates a little bit to what we're talking about here, I think specifically because we're talking about a really broken system that we all know has some fault lines that need exceptional and in some cases radical redesign. So I had the great good fortune to run with an exceptional team, one of whom you'll hear from later, a grassroots organization based in India for 15 years that worked in the renewable energy and access to energy space through and with women. Now that solution, which is actually one of the United Nations top 20 solutions to the SDGs and climate as a synergistic solution, we were able as a team to scale that to 96 countries, to reach nearly 2.5 million people, and to replicate that in 6 other countries now. What it taught me was about how to work in a systems lens, how to work bringing government, private sector, multilateral organizations, advocacy, and storytelling behind a very low-resourced, actually, organization, and the power of understanding all of those pieces. So Step Up then went on to spend 2 years after the pandemic working in private sector. We worked in private sector. I wanted to understand and learn why the force of the market was not able to move much quicker and much more forcefully at addressing the climate situation when they had mechanisms like ESG and value creation and shared value as actual targets within those organizations. So what was stopping that? And of course, I learned that finance, which Barbara will understand, finance is largely a problem there because actually our capital markets and their incentives are not aligned to the outcomes that we want our companies to move towards. So that's a systemic problem, right? And how do we solve that? And I then decided I needed to learn about INGOs. So Step Up went to work as the first entrepreneur in residence for CARE, which is one of the world's largest NGOs, to understand why and how an international NGO, which had such power and opportunity to address some of these problems we've been talking about today, also wasn't moving fast enough and having the impact. So the sum total of all of those really is now, this year, to launch a distinct initiative to work with social enterprises, award-winning social enterprises that need and must go to scale. Because we do not have a problem with enough solutions. We know the lessons of community. We know the lessons of the power of women. We know the solutions and have the technology to solve so many of our climate-related and disaster and migration and nutrition-related issues. The problem is we live in this fragmented finance landscape, fragmented support landscape that has private sector, that has finance, that has philanthropy, and none of them are working together because everybody wants to own a solution. But nobody can own these solutions singly. We need to own these solutions collectively. Collective thinking takes mediation, and it takes structured scaffolding to push people through those partnerships, to orchestrate those partnerships, to govern those partnerships, and to make sure that they are achieving the outcomes that we all want and need. So that's really where my focus is now for the next 10 years, specifically looking at technology, the power of technology to scale things, young people and the challenges we have with the number of young people in the global south who need to join a positive, value-creating workforce and how they can work more smartly, and leadership, how we can really start to leverage what we know about women's leadership at community level, what we know about women in government and the power they can have and the way they can move policy in the right direction, how we can use women in private sector to network and be better and much more powerful in their leadership and stewardship of resources in positive value-creating ways. So I think leadership is a big key.
I appreciate that so much. I love that you're working on that scaffolding to connect and do cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary. In the worlds that I work in, it's called translational, implementation science, or team science. We think about that all the time. And it reminds me of Dr. Tedros at the World Health Organization, when in the beginning of the pandemic, he said we need two things to end the COVID-19 pandemic: science and solidarity. And he said we have the science. We need the solidarity. And thinking about that from a systems perspective is really important. Here's the thing about science. Biology and physics will always get you. You don't have to believe in gravity, but if you jump off a building, it's going to impact you. We don't have the same thing with social structures and governance systems. We have to build accountability. So I'm wondering if we can transition a little bit to thinking about accountability. We had these conversations individually. And I know that Maria Isabel and I had a great conversation about that. How do we bring accountability to this space? We have these great solutions, but how do we know they're working the way they're supposed to work? And I'm wondering if I can go to Mary Ellen. Perhaps, Mary Ellen, you can talk about the Maya Declaration a little bit. Or if you weren't going to go there, you don't have to do it. It's my jet lag again.
No. I know that was going to be part of my larger answer. Mo, it has just been so much fun just jotting down these pearls of wisdom, resilience, bouncing forward, and stories with a soul. I've just so enjoyed your intervention. So thank you for that. So I think it's really appropriate that I would follow those comments by Megan, because, as Barbara mentioned earlier, women are getting sort of 1/10 of 1% of climate finance. I mean, this is just, what is 1/10 of 1%? It's absolutely nothing. And the fragmentation that Megan talked about, I think, is absolutely important, but at least for a number of other solutions. And I think, I'm not remembering who it was on the first panel, talked about, finance people always talk about risk. You can use fragmentation actually as a way of dealing with different types of risk. Some of the most effective structures or ones that say, oh, I'm willing to take this amount of risk for this amount of return, and so I'll take this piece of a structure. So I don't necessarily think fragmentation is entirely a bad thing, and that we can use it to reach people where they are and hit the pain points that is keeping them from moving forward, as you say, given that they've made these ground pronouncements around ESG, around climate. But in my world, the financial inclusion world, this world of trying to bring the nearly billion women who are completely excluded from the formal financial system, there are actually some pretty interesting mechanisms for accountability. You mentioned the Maya Declaration. This was a piece of advocacy that Women's World Banking was very engaged in right from the early days, and I think back in 2011, where the central banks of the global South came together and said, this is where the problem resides. It resides in the South. How are we going to hold ourselves accountable to bringing more people into the system? And I give such great credit to the very significant numbers of women, unfortunately, deputy central bankers across Africa. Not yet the governors, but the deputy governors, who said, "Yeah, it's our problem, but you're not going to even crack the problem unless you bring women into the system. And how are we going to hold you, central banks, accountable to bringing more women into the system?" And so we announced this Maya Declaration. I forget the numbers, 113 countries or something signed on. But what that has actually translated into is something called National Financial Inclusion Strategies. I know that sounds really like a mouthful and gobbledygook, perhaps. But what it has meant is, I think it's 53 countries in the global South have now very publicly announced that they will, they're going to reach certain financial inclusion targets. What unfortunately we see very often is they'll make a big announcement, they'll kind of lump women and men together. And then about 3 years into the strategy, they'll realize that they haven't made much progress with women. And so the overall target is not being reached. That's kind of where we come to the rescue. We've worked with some of the largest countries with some of the largest gender gaps in financial inclusion: Nigeria, Mexico, Indonesia, to cater to tailor those strategies specifically to the things that are really pain points for women. I wasn't initially a real name and shame fan, but it really does seem to matter to a lot of these governments. The Global Findex is the database that most is probably the most authoritative database on financial inclusion. It's housed at the World Bank. And we've seen that governments really care about those numbers and will fight to the death about whether or not their internal data lines up with what the Findex is showing them, because those numbers are going to be announced. Those numbers are going to have their name next to them. So I'm actually pretty heartened by the accountability mechanisms that are in the financial inclusion space. But I never can just end on that point without saying, just having a bank account is not financial inclusion. You've got to be able to have the full range of financial services that I mentioned in my earlier remarks. And as we look at the adaptation to the climate risks, maybe we need those bundled, maybe we need them combined with other solutions as well.
Thank you so much. You make me think about, no matter how old we get, what position we get, whether we're in government or not, we're still in high school in our head sometimes. Peer pressure works sometimes. It works sometimes. Maria Isabel. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think that one important thing for us as journalists when regards to accountability is trying to bring the facts to the table. So in Mongabay, we have worked a lot to bring in those facts related to these realities. For example, we've made an investigation because we know that indigenous people are in danger, but we want to know more about the magnitude, the extent of those dangers in environmental communities. So in Peru, we did an investigation that used geo-reference data from more than 2,000 indigenous communities, and we overlapped that information with data sets from coca crops, illegal mining, illegal airstrips, deforestation, and what we found from that analysis is that 1,200 communities, indigenous communities, were surrounded by one of those environmental crimes, if not the two or more at once. So that gives us the idea that they are really fighting for their lives every day. And that helps indigenous organizations to support their claims, because they have denouncing this. But sometimes authorities don't believe in the testimonies. They need this hard evidence of this problem. So one thing is facts. The only thing is making the state accountable. For example, regarding the oil industry, we want to know how many oil companies have been sanctioned by the government. Spoiler alert, not so many much. But we want to ask the governments, okay, what have you done with all these oil spills and these environmental liabilities that we know are on the ground? So, for example, we asked Bolivian government to give us all the sanctions. They said, no, they never responded, despite the insistence, and it's their duty. You know, we asked the Ecuadorian government for the same things. So they said they can give us the number of oil spills they counted, but not which enterprise or company have made the oil spills. And they cannot say if they have sanctioned any of those companies. So, what? But you are the government. You have to do that. You have to give us that information. Colombia government gave us a little bit of information, only from one region, and the only one that gave us all the information was Peru. That was great for me. But the idea is that having no answer is also news, because we have to push the governments to give us the information we know they don't want to give to the public. Because when people said, oh, no, it's not the indigenous people, they don't like investments, they are against progress. Why? That's not true. As they have illegal minings, oil spills, environmental liabilities. They have no reason, they have no facts to be for these things. So one thing is facts, the other things that we're trying to do is highlighting this solution, these opportunities, and the role of these leaders, women leaders, because they have also a lot of difficulties to get into being political leader. As we have problems to get me as a journalist in a position of power, also for indigenous women. They have to, I've seen them go to the meetings that are from one place that you have to take a boat to be in the river for 9 hours with their children, because you have to go with them, and trying to have or to build the same circumstances than men to be on those roles. So they work harder to try to be in that position. And I think we have now very inspired leaders, women leaders in Brazil, in Ecuador, and in Peru, but we need more. So we try always to put her in our coverage, and that's number 3. I think that also women in being journalists have a unique perspective to deal with these topics. I'm the head of Mongabay Latam, and I know for a fact that we always try to put in our coverage a number of women, because I know there's women that can have a really interesting voice. We have a section that only highlights indigenous women leaders in the Amazon. We have a spot for women in science. So we try to put on to give them a space in our journalistic coverage. And that happens when you have a woman that is deciding that. And that's also a fact. So I think that's some ways to keep that accountability.
I appreciate that. And goes to show you the important role of a free press and of having journalism there to take government to account. It's so important. Thank you. Megan or Laurence, would you like to go talk a little bit about accountability, specifically in your...
Sure. I love the way you call me Laurence. It's great. Thank you. It sounds so sophisticated. Sorry to let you down. I often... So GAIN, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, we have 6 core values. And 2 of them I'm really proud of 2 in particular, integrity and humility. And I think they're really key for accountability because, let me do a little sidestep. I live in the UK, and we have a new government, centre-left government, and they made a big commitment to building more social housing in the UK. And so everyone thinks this is a great idea. Well, most people think it's a great idea until planning permission is requested for an area near your house or in your neighborhood. And so there's the expression in the UK, I don't know if it's common outside of the UK, NIMBY, not in my backyard. And I think accountability is a bit like that too. So I think the most powerful form of accountability is your own accountability. It's very easy to hold other people to account, but it's very hard to hold yourself to account. So about 5 years ago, there was this, 6 years ago, there was this new initiative in the global health field. Some of you may have heard of it called Global Health 50/50. And it's a ranking, it's an assessment and a ranking of 200 organizations, public and private, in the global health field. And GAIN is one of the ones that was evaluated. So my first reaction was, oh my God, I hope we do well. So the first evaluation, and I've got one of my board members in the audience here, so I'm really pleased to say we did do well, but we were in the top 30%. And this is an evaluation that's done by a university and another independent organization. And they look at your organizational structure, what's the women leadership, what's the board like in terms of gender representation, what's the strategic leadership, what's the country leadership. It looks at all the different grades. It looks at your policies, how are they framed, how are they relevant for men and women. It looks at your programs. Are you collecting data that's gender disaggregated? Are you working, are enough of your programs or all of your programs focusing enough on gender, women's empowerment? So it goes through everything. And we did pretty well in the 30%, in the top 30%. But I was quite nervous about it. And there was one in particular I was very nervous because I didn't know the answer. The answer was, are you discriminating against women in your salary scales? And so it's a very sophisticated piece of analysis. It's essentially an econometric regression. It looks at where staff are, which location are they in, because we have 16 offices around the world. It looks at what's their grade. We have 10 different grades. It looks at how long you've been in position. And then it controls for all of that as best you can in a multiple regression. And it says, does whether someone is male or female make a difference to their salary? I'm really pleased to say it didn't make a difference. But there was one area where we were weak, and that, embarrassingly, is my own strategic management team. So at the board level, we're fantastic. We have a female board chair, we have a female vice chair. 2 of our 3 subcommittees are headed by women. But at the strategic management level, my 6 people, only 2 of them were women. Actually, now it's only 1 because one of the women left. And so I am now very anxious about changing that balance, so I have at least 3 and 3. And we're working on it, and I think by this time next year, if I'm invited back, I'll report to you on what that is. But all I'm trying to say is that accountability starts at home. And it's really hard and really uncomfortable, but it's the thing that changes, it moves the needle for organizations like mine, for countries, for businesses. But you have to take it seriously, and the people who are doing the evaluations, they do it brilliantly, actually, the Global Health 50/50. They don't name and shame, they fame and shame, right? So if you're doing well, they make a big deal about it. And if you're doing badly, they make a big deal about it too. So peer pressure really counts.
So if you're looking for a job as a woman executive, go talk to. I wanted to also mention that, you know, what's fascinating to me from a public health standpoint, we tend to think of how do you prevent disease and injury, not just how we treat disease and injury. And I would tend to think of gender equality in the same way. How do we prevent a global crisis? You have gender equality as an input, not just the output of a product. So I really appreciate that share and how evaluation frameworks can be used strategically. You really modeled that here. I thought that was really great. Megan.
So, you know, there's the expression that says, an apology that's not followed by behavior change is pretty empty. And so for me, this conversation about transparency and accountability, if transparency and creation of data and reporting and metrics that countries and organizations are meant to do is simply an exercise that ends there and isn't followed by the mandatory, you know, remediation plan for how that's going to improve, I don't really have a lot of confidence in that. One of the great lessons I learned in rural India was a system called social audit. Social audit was, so many years ago, the World Bank would go around and announce projects, and they'd put up a giant billboard in the community. Hospital will be built here, or school will be built here. And you'd go back 3 years later, and there was no school built there. There was nothing built there. And you still see this in places like the Pacific Islands. But what happened was the communities themselves developed a mechanism for self-transparency. They gathered together and they sat there and documented what had or had not happened in that community. And they marched en masse to the local panchayat and submitted that. But they did more than that. They laid down on the road, stopped traffic, and sent it to a Supreme Court judge. It's an extreme example. But no social transformative movement has ever happened without the mobilization from community level up. Human beings must decide they own the climate problem and that they are prepared to mobilize collectively and fight to protect the place that they live and the way of life that they have. So yes, we have some outstanding systems. The nationally driven commitments are being developed right now by countries where they will commit to their climate targets and they will then be measured on those climate targets. And there actually is, believe it or not, a pretty robust system for that. What they then do when they don't make them, that's a little bit more up in the air, and that very much depends regionally and for other reasons. Corporations have even less transparency, even though they put all sorts of fancy mechanisms in place. There's lots of ways you can spin that. And so until consumers stop buying the thing, until they stop asking for that thing that we know is bad and putting their money in their wallet there, a company is not going to be motivated to stop doing that thing. So we have so much more power as individuals than we realize we do. We think in this climate conversation, I'm just one woman, what can I do? But actually there's a lot we can do. And the biggest thing is exactly what you said, which is to convene, like we are here today, like Project Dandelion is trying to mobilize us to do, like many of the women in finance networks are trying to do. This power of convening is very strong. The power of social audit, even on a large scale, is really powerful. And we need to be able to get those stories told. That's the end of that thing, and the advocacy done in order to really move and put pressure. I don't know any politician who has ever moved other than with a shame and name. Unless it's a woman, believe it or not, because women permanent secretaries who are not politically appointed but are, you know, actually in permanent jobs, work wonders under and behind the scenes to make things move. They're incredibly powerful, but quietly so. And I think that's my lesson on women. Women in communities, women who back grassroots organizations, women who are leading change on the front line, are themselves adapting constantly to the power dynamics around them, to the levers of change that they see in front of them, and they adapt their behavior and the way they approach with a really smart way to move things. And we don't give them enough resources and enough power to really, or enough understanding of their power to really push those levers.
This has been such a rich conversation. I could just talk to our wonderful panelists forever. As a way to wrap up this panel, because I think we're out of time, right? As a way to wrap up this panel, I'm wondering, Megan started us off a little bit. What is one action that you can share with our wonderful audience here and online? I forgot to greet you all online. That they can take away from here, from this conference, and really give back and give to the communities to make our needles move on the conversation that we're having, and also on action. Maybe this time I'll start with our brother.
I like that. Thank you, Mo. So I don't know if this is oversharing or not. It might be. But
We love it. We're women.
Okay, good. It's not that exciting, don't worry. My mother divorced my father. My father's an alcoholic. My mother divorced my father when I was 7. And I think it was one of the most singular acts of bravery I've ever been a witness to, because she didn't have any money. She left him, and she lived on welfare for the next 10 years until I was 16 or 17. And she was just such a powerful person and so resourceful, but she was so alone. I remember, she was fighting the state, fighting for free school meals for me, fighting for free school uniforms, always fighting for the family, me and my sister. And she was very alone. So I think I always try to, I don't always succeed, but I always try to, whenever I see whenever I'm a young woman, any young person, especially women who reach out to me over the last 40 years, whether it's a student, an intern. I met 2 GAIN interns yesterday. Jennifer, we were there. Jennifer, you were there. Jennifer Blanke, and we were talking about how can I help you in your career forward. And I think young women, especially, I've mentored lots of young women and young men over the last 40 years, and this is very unscientific. But the sample size is quite big, but it's probably very skewed. The young men mostly say to me, how can I be the leader of my field by the time I'm 30? That's pretty much, that would be how I encapsulate it. And my message to them is, learn your craft, be patient, learn your craft, be kind to people, and it'll come before you know it. The young women I talk to are, in many ways, much more talented than the young men, but they have much less confidence. So my message is, when you see a young woman especially, or any young person, but especially a young woman, be a champion, be an ally, be a support, sometimes just be a pair of ears that just listens and doesn't say anything. So that's whether it's at your school or your community center or your job, wherever, do it.
Well, I think Lawrence said something that is very important, that is, for us, storytelling is very powerful. I think that making visible things is powerful, and it's not always only the task of journalists. I think that we can be this shift for this narrative that I have told them about women. So what if we take as a duty to talk about the strong women that we know? Could be our mothers, our sisters, could be the indigenous leader that you have read in a Manga Bay article. What if we also be this person that are going to deliver the stories of these remarkable women around the world? And if we bring these topics to the conversation every time we have a discussion with scientists, with development people, so we try to to tell them that there's big, 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 important, huge stories of resistance around the world, I think that could make a difference whenever it is necessary.
I think that the climate crisis is absolutely one of the most complex and interconnected challenges that has a multitude of additional challenges and crises that ripple out from it. And that can feel very overwhelming to us as individuals, but even to us who work in that space. And we as human beings tend to want to look at the simple, or the simple solution, or the reductive solution that gives us more of a sense of security. And I guess my response to that would be to embrace discourse on climate, at home, at work, with your friends, with your colleagues. The more we are able to engage in a lively discourse where we actually are together thinking through those problems, the more we will feel in service to the planet and our fellow human beings. And I think somewhere in there sits the pathway to us all feeling agency and some type of positive contribution, irrespective of what the magnitude of that is.
From Megan there, to the extent that we have some extraordinary philanthropists and investors in the audience, both in the room and online, embrace that complexity that Megan mentioned. When you are trying to make a decision about what to support, how to invest, where to put your support, insist on an intersectional approach. If an approach doesn't consider both finance and health, or climate and education, or water and sanitation and finance, you have to embrace the intersectionality of this crisis. And then if you haven't exhausted your imaginations by then, I think two of the things that came so strongly out of this panel for me this morning in my time, afternoon yours, is the importance of representation and the real difference that women's leadership makes to any solution, and then building in accountability for what you say or what anyone that you're looking to support is telling you they're looking to accomplish.
You wrapped it up so beautifully. I would like to ask the audience to help me thank our wonderful panelists in wrapping up. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That when we were planning this conference, I kept thinking of how we used to analyze poetry, go from the big picture to the more detailed and then more detailed, and this is what we're being able to unravel and to see things in a much deeper way each time the panel comes on. So thank you so much for that.